Buddy, this is that was some AI Lou Reed. Thought it was kind of appropriate. How is everyone doing? It is 12 o'clock. Today is Wednesday, April 9th, and this is the AI Biz Hour with Andy and John. And we have a sponsor, which is Virtual Synergy Inc. What if you could free up hours in your day without sacrificing productivity? Successful entrepreneurs know the secret. They delegate. If you're looking for an employee to handle your administrative tasks, there's no better employee than a virtual assistant from Virtual Synergy Inc. He connects you with skilled human virtual assistants who handle your administrative work, emails, and scheduling so you can focus on what truly matters, your business. And that's important, and we're super excited. I'm going to get for our guest today, truly eclectic and has done so many things at a high level. I'm very, very excited to have Graham here, and I am in the middle of working to get another co-host on. I always seem to have a little trouble with this as we do it when we start off. I apologize. Andy or Graham, how are you doing this morning? And Andy should be getting up here in a minute.
Hey, John, I am doing very well this morning. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you for having me. How are you doing?
Doing excellent. What time is it there where you are at?
Just after 9 p.m. Central European time.
Excellent. Andy, how are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Graham, thank you so much for coming. I've joined a number of your spaces, listened and read. I've tried to read your stuff, but I'm really interested in your idea of the AI and the human mind and how that all works together. I'm fascinated by that. So I'm hoping that we can get into that conversation today, because to me, it's fascinating. And I would really love to hear you explain it, because I probably feel like I'm totally wrong and you're way more qualified. I'd really love to get better in my own mind.
Well, thank you, Andy, and hi. I actually don't think it's possible to be wrong. I just think that we're all trying to figure it out right now. Some people have spent more time than others, and some people have sort of decided to bypass it altogether as a concern. Intersectionality is a key phrase, which might be a placeholder for this conversation, which is the idea of how all of these different technologies, when they intersect, come to affect us as a species. And we can talk about that more as we sort of organically get through the conversation. But we're seeing right now just little pinpoints of their influence, albeit very large, but from separate companies. But when they intersect, when computer vision and haptic feedback and FNIRS for thought inferencing and the emotive side of our digital lives and the sensory side of our environment and us and the geospatial environment, both how we move around it and what's in it. And all of that is in one place under the control or controlled by one person or one group or one government or multiple governments, but for different reasons. What does it mean? And how do we evolve? Do we evolve? How do our governments and our societies become affected? And how does individuality and cognition handle this? And how are we exposed? And how are we empowered? I guess they really are the essential elements of the ethics and futurist side of things. And yeah, I don't want to get too deep too quickly, so I'll hand it back to you guys, because I know that some background maybe is probably appropriate before we get into that. But I'm delighted to be here. I mean, I've known you guys forever from a distance, and I'm really, super pleased and honored to have a space with my name on it as a special guest, and that never gets.
Well, that's
never changes. Never changes. Yeah.
I am humbled by the people who come to the space on a regular basis, and by our guests. And I'm really, you know, you've got a mastery of business. You've exited multiple businesses, and you have a great education. I was just curious, were you around academics? Were you around business people? What was like, you know, every people have things that formulate kind of who they are. My dad said he knew he was going to be a scientist when he was like 3 years old, and he was, you know, blowing things up in the basement and all kinds of stuff. And so some people, you know, really know exactly who they are right away, and others find it and explore over time. I'm curious about yourself in that aspect.
Well, thanks, Sean. Well, I'm from the Republic of Ireland, Northside Dublin. In the late '60s and '70s was when I was, going. I hit 13 in 1980. I was born in 1968. So the environment I grew up in, contrary to the current persona of Ireland, was for all intents and purposes a third world country. We possessed no infrastructure. We were transitioning from a government which, since independence in 1922, where we'd become a free state, and then a republic in 1947, we come from a position where one of the leaders of the 1916 revolution, Eamon de Valera, who was only not executed when captured after it because he had an American mother and the British did not want to upset the Americans by executing him, he had become Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, for multiple years, and President. And alongside of him, Archbishop McQuaid had sort of ruled with an iron fist. And this was a time when the famous red light district of Monto, which is in North Dublin, around the Dockside area, if anybody wants to familiarise themselves with the story of Monto, it'll tell the story of Ireland, really. A guy called Terry Fagan, Tenement City, wrote a book about it called Madam's Murder and Black Coddle. But Monto was the second largest red light district in the world after Algiers, because we had 200,000 British troops on our soil, as well as a very active port. We were the second city of the British Empire. And I was born on that side of the city. My grandparents were born not far from that district of Monto, in Northside city centre, Dublin, in Ivy Gardens, which is named after Lord Guinness's charity, who they built social housing for people in the tenements. But my family tree says that my grandfather on my paternal side, in the census of 1901, was living in Mansion House Ward in a tenement in one room with his wife, 6 kids, her mother and father, and 2 lodgers in one room, which was typical of Dublin. My father himself was born in 1941, and he grew up in the tenements too, in the basement of a tenement, and was, while my grandfather was in a trade and made some money, he had to go to England to get work, so he was absent most of the time. So my father found himself homeless and left school at 14. And at that time, unless you had money, you did not get the opportunity to go to university. The only way you could do that was by getting a scholarship. And the only way you could get a scholarship was actually through the London City and Guilds exams. So he duly went off and got a scholarship, and he got a scholarship to what we refer to as tech, or technical school, on Bolton Street in particular. He did it in engineering, and then got a scholarship to go to Trinity College Dublin, which, as everybody knows, is one of the oldest universities in the world, founded by early on in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the oldest chartered university. He got a degree in engineering, aeronautical engineering, and a master's in statistics, and went on to become a test pilot. But my family life was no background of entrepreneurialism. The idea in Ireland at those times was own your own house at all costs. We had 90+% home ownership after in the 70s. We had no motorways. My mother's side of the family was rural, Central Ireland, in a place called Croghan, which, according to Celtic legend, is the centre of Ireland. It's not geographically the centre, but according to Celtic lore, it is. And she had 11 brothers and sisters, which was typical. And she came to Dublin at 18, like most people in large families. Only the eldest brother got to inherit the farm. So they met, and I have two brothers and a sister, and we all had, typical childhoods while the Civil War was going on in Northern Ireland and in Dublin. My ex-father-in-law was blown up in the 1973 Dublin Monaghan bombings. Two of my uncles were hung by the IRA, and two by the Black and Tans, were shot by the Black and Tans, and one was shot by the Irish Free State Army in the ambush at Geeshel. So we'd a long history in the country on all sides of it, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But my upbringing was typical of Irish. I went to, at that time, Holy Faith Nuns when I was 4 and 5, De La Salle Brothers in Finglas, which is in North Dublin, for what we call secondary school, which is up to the age of 11. And until I was 16, went to secondary school in St. Declan's in Cabra, in Christian Brothers, and then Jesuits. So we were in a world where they let the girls' school out half an hour before us in case we would meet at the bus stop and have impure thoughts. So I had no background in my family of entrepreneurialism, and I left school, and my first jobs were when I was in college, McDonald's and pushing trolleys in supermarkets, just like I'd done from the age of 11. And then I went and took a year off after I finished, and went on to start in financial services. But my background, there's nothing in it that would suggest that I would follow this path. In fact, my father was very immune to risk. He was a risk-averse person. He passed away in 2006 at the untimely age of 64. He had taken us to Seattle for 2 years in 1980 because he was going to be working for Boeing. We lived in Vancouver and San Juan Islands, but around the time Mount St. Helens blew up. But he and my mom preferred to live in Ireland, so returned to Ireland we did. So yeah, a non-typical background, but a very typical Irish background. Parents, one rural, one city, both dirt poor. Both did everything in their power, blood, sweat, and tears to give us a proper education, a set of values, and a set of morals. Made sacrifices at every stage, and continue to do so. My mother is like a platoon of Marines at 84 years of age, an unstoppable woman. And my father, unfortunately, as I say, passed away at 64 from intestinal colonic cancer, which runs in my paternal side of the family. So yeah, that's my background. Generally, it's the background of anybody who wasn't born wealthy in this country and acquired a degree around my time took that route, more or less. My degree was paid for by my workplace. A sponsored degree when I worked as a systems programmer for Allied Irish Banks and First Trust Bank in Maryland. And that's fairly typical. The intake rates were tiny. The number of university places were tiny. I mean, 6,000 or 7,000 per year. So that's a typical background, both my parents and my grandparents, who were tenement dwellers, and my father's side, and small scrub farmers, but also hard workers, 16 hours a day workers with huge families, 11 in my mother's, as I say, all of whom either went to Dublin or England to find work. Thanks.
That's yeah. I grew up in Long Island, and so I had a lot of friends that were Irish, whose family moved to the Bronx from Ireland, and good friends. So it's it's definitely a unique culture, and Irish are a great group. I don't know how you'd say it, but they're a wonderful. It's a good thing that the Irish are here. So, Andy, do you want to? I have some.
Go ahead, John. I've had a number of teams, but in Ireland, in Dublin. I've never been there, but I want to go. But I had a team that was they were a support team for an international project I was working on, and it was delightful to go from listening to people from Australia to people to listening to the Irish speak, to because they were supporting Europe and the Australians were supporting Indo-Asia, and I was constantly delighted by listening to all these lovely voices from around the world, and I hear that in Graham's voice, and I appreciate it. I sound like every TV, I grew up in California for the most part in the Midwest. And so my accent sounds like what you hear on TV. So I kind of consider myself, I don't have an accent, but everyone else has some loveliness to their voice. And I just appreciate that. I find it just fascinating and wonderful. But I do have a question for you, Graham. How, with that kind of background, which is amazing and wonderful, regardless of its challenges, we don't need to think we need to go there. How did you get into entrepreneurship? What drove you out of that risk averseness that your family seemed to have into kind of being a founder and starting these things and starting other things? What was the driver? Just maybe what happened there?
That's a great question because it's really hard to answer. Part of it was rebelliousness because I sort of traversed. I was the eldest, so I had to break all the barriers so that my two younger brothers and sister could get less of a less hassle when they wanted to go to the Friday night disco at 15, or didn't arrive home at 11 p.m. and we're out till 2 a.m. I had to break all those. The first kid always gets it harder, right? So what also drove me out of it was I've always been anti-establishment in the sense that not against the grain. Like in school, secondary school, as we call it, from the age of 12 till 16, I guess high school in the States. I was a sporty kid. I did, believe it or not, to look at me now, I was a gymnast when I was 8 to 12. I represented Ireland in European Championships in 1981. I played football, as in real football, Gaelic Athletic Association, Irish football, for my secondary school or high school. I did play rugby.
No rugby?
I did play rugby, yeah, after I left school. But you got to bear in mind, Andy, and here's a throwback. We were not allowed to play rugby as
right.
Catholics. Yeah, we were not allowed to play there was no St. Declan's in Cabra, and O'Connell's school and all the other schools in the vicinity had no rugby teams. That was a phenomenon of the south side of Dublin, which is considered to be the let's say the 90210 sort of code. But we were not allowed to play rugby. It was a British sport. And this is, I'm here speaking to you as 57 years of age. So this is not a million years ago. So after I left school, I played rugby from the age of 17 because in the part of northwest Dublin that I moved to when I had a girlfriend and we moved in together, there's a rugby team. And it was a good way of beating the shit out of other people without getting arrested. And I'm not even joking, I mean, it was real, with Gaelic and with as you guys call it, soccer. Rugby was a real opportunity, and I was heavily into the gym and boxing. Rugby was real, no pads and full contact, and I was a first centre in the Leinster Senior League. So Leinster is one of the 4 provinces of Ireland. So the first centre is the guy after the out half
He's
and
behind the
scroll.
prop. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but that's So that's the tight head, loose head prop, and then you've got wingers. So I started off as a right winger in the front row, and then I was a crash center, and then ended up as a full back. But it was really physical exertion and being able, real heavy physical exertion that I enjoyed in the rugby. And we got promoted a few times. And but my work. So how did I get into it? Well, the idea is that rebellion or anti-establishment came obvious to me very quickly when I was working. My first boss, when I was in a senior role, I was appointed, to it was IBM mainframes and mid-range systems like AS400s and tandems and robotics libraries, IBM Grau and um, uh, storage tech for second line, tape storage retrieval for first line data. Remember in those days, an entire bank was run off less memory than there, or less memory and storage data than there is in the worst burner phone that you'll. First boss was a bully, and also one of those types that stole your work and represented it for his own. And I never liked that in school. I never liked bullies, obviously. But some people stand by and do nothing. But I recall when they gave free milk in the school, in secondary school or high school, and in my second year there, I remember one dude was being badly bullied by some guys, and they poured our cartons of milk over their head. And me and some other guys went over and kicked the shit out of these bully guys. But they're eventually expelled. But that was the exception rather than the norm. So I think rebelliousness and bellicoseness, and also myself and my father had very different opinions on risk. And therefore, I did not vibe with the idea of spending 40 years in a safe, pensionable job with a $120,000 job. And I certainly didn't subscribe to the sycophantic, brown nosing type of behavior that Ireland required if you were going to climb up the greasy pole of promotion, although I was promoted a number of times. So I think that's what really, I think personality, workplace experience, and general rebelliousness against what I was expected to do, and in the particular case of maybe the difference of opinion of worldview between myself and my father, I mean, he was horrified when I handed in my resignation and an equivalent to a very high six-figure salary and a permanent job with a guaranteed pension to be called self-employed.
Was your rebelliousness kind of directed towards your father and it went out in all kinds of ways, or was it just directed towards authority? I mean, Irish are notorious warriors, but also through the literature and what it's just a very unique place. And I'm just curious because what brought you towards academia? Was that rebellion as well, or because what you're going into now is so interesting and so important, I believe, and to have a fighter spirit for that is absolutely necessary in this time and day. And so yeah, if we could kind of go from your education and then stepping into your career, did you start with an education before you started working, or have you been doing this as you've been working?
Yeah, so the trajectory that I took was not defined by a tug of war with my father. Definitely not. I was the least favored of the four sons and daughters because I was troublesome. But when he was dying, he was in the hospice for 3 weeks in a coma. I did sleep in the same room with him for those 3 weeks, and at 4:05 p.m. on Sunday, the 16th of December 2006, I had to take a call, and I had to go to the office to take that call. And he died at 4:08 on the 18th of December. And when I got the phone call, I thought to myself, how do I feel? And, I felt sadness. I always looked for his approval um, during all those years of when we would not necessarily be vibing along the same lines, to say the least. But the idea of being anti-establishment is not is not an anarchist, is not to tear down everything and burn it to the ground. It's the idea that you do not accept a status quo that is inherently and systemically unfair, inconsistent, grotesque, unprecedented, bizarre, and unbelievable in the way Irish society was organized. And just I had the good luck to have the opportunity to travel because of my father's position as a test pilot. And I saw other countries and other people's way of behaving, and it was, of course, the backdrop of the IRA and the INLA, Republican paramilitaries operating in our neighborhoods, and also not in our neighborhoods, but operating against them, the likes of the UDR, the UVF, and the British Army. So it was a time when also music played a huge part. Like, I was a punk when I was 9. There's a book of pics of Dublin, and I happened to be in one of them, 3 11-year-olds trying to look like punks, wearing badges and stuff. And then I got into ska, which was, if you don't know, two-tone, which came out of the UK with bands like The Specials and so on. It was sort of a reggae mix, came out of sort of South London. And then I never vibed with the new romantic thing, because it's heavy metal type of stuff, but it was very tribalistic. So when we went into town for a drink, like, one of the famous bars at that time was Barclay Dunn's, another one, the Pygmalion, and also Brussels, which is still around. I mean, there would necessarily at the end of every night be a fist fight. But regarding schooling, I think the best song, I mean, I'm a huge fan of John Lennon, and he wrote a song called Working Class Hero. And one of the lines in it is, they despise you if you're clever, and they hate you if you're clever, and they despise a fool, so you can't win. So what happened to me was, I was a high achieving kid in this De La Salle school before high school. But in high school, being clever was considered to be what people used to refer to as being a lick or teacher's pet. So you had to be clever in secret. So the answer to your question is, I did it by stealth, and I pursued work and education in parallel when I became a late teenage, early 20s. So that's where the idea of having a subsidized degree played a part. And in fairness to Allied Irish banks, despite the fact they've been bailed out twice and have taken our sovereign wealth fund through their shenanigans and into financial crashes and also some corruption, the pursuance of education as a lifelong curiosity has always been something that I was interested in personally. I mean, when I say be clever by stealth, I would read a lot. Well, I had no one to speak to it about it because none of my buddies sort of read a lot. There's a heavy culture of drinking. There wasn't a culture of drugs. There was a serious heroin problem in Dublin, but not in the part of Dublin I lived in. It wasn't a very available drug. Weed was almost non-existent, except in arty circles. I had some buddies who did start smoke weed, but this culture shock for me was when I went to the States at 12 and went to school there for a while, and the difference between, co-ed classes were freaking me out big time, because we were just all boys, as I say, separated from the girls, and even in social environments when we were out at night time, there was nothing to do. We hung around street corners, or we went into gaming arcades and played video games or played pool, but there was not a typical mix. And we also had a big sort of turf war type of thing going on with anybody from South Dublin, who they would be the rugby schools, the private schools, the people who went to boarding schools, the wealthy families who had businesses that were inherited, multi-generational, or who had benefited from the state becoming a republic, and in doing so had actually appropriated a lot of the state's assets for themselves. But we won't get into that. But that's where it wasn't defined by my father my relationship with my father, this rebelliousness. It's sort of in me. You can see from my family tree and the history I told you about my family's participation, both in my paternal and maternal sides, both in the Civil War and the War of Independence. And we can trace our family tree. The Penross is a Cornish name, so one of my ancestors was a negotiator for the barons who revolted against King John, and uh, he was a baronial negotiator from Cornwall who ended up being part of the creation of the Great Charter, or Magna Carta, which of course is the foundation of all of our of all our constitutional republics and democracies. So with an unusual surname like that, it's really useful because you can trace your lineage, and we have done so back to also the Doomsday Book. So Pen Ross is top of the heath in Gaelic, um, Cornwall Gaelic, and you got to also remember that Cornwall in England was a kingdom of its own, as was Devon. And like Wales, it was one of the last parts of England that came under the crown in London before they turned their heads towards Scotland. So my people came on boats to Ireland, bound for the States in the early 1600s, which stopped off at Cork City, just like the Titanic. But my crowd got off in Cork, whether they missed the boat due to a hangover or were just intending to stay in Cork, I do not know. But there they stayed for 200 years. For 100 years, they were bandits in Wicklow and Kilkenny, which is mountainous region. And then for the last 10 generations in Dublin City in various forms or another. I hope that has answered your question.
Absolutely. And I was just curious where you were in the States, um, and how that informed you, because it sounds like it was a bit of culture shock. I remember growing up in Long Island, and stories of what was happening in Ireland through the 80s were heart wrenching, and I don't know if many people are even aware of what happened at that time. But where were you in the States, and at what time in your life?
Yeah, so as a kid, I mean, I was 12 and 13. So, I mean, on the way, we passed through Chicago O'Hare, and I remember there was some blue rinse hair lady sitting on on the bus as we were getting a transfer from one side of the airport to the other. And they heard myself and my sister talking and asked whether we were refugees. Which to me sounded really weird. I mean, this thing was going on all around us, but we didn't really pay. It's sort of when something is so familiar, it almost becomes invisible. I mean, clearly it isn't invisible when there's buildings blown up, but I wasn't in a war zone. Bono and his famous quote about being in a war zone living in Dublin. The only round, as I say, that Bono ever dodged was when it was his turn to buy the next round in the local pub. Um, Dublin was bombed a number of times, and there were threats of bombings, and there was marches by unionists, but it was thoroughly and utterly completely different than Belfast. But when we crossed the border, which was a hard border with 100-foot observer towers, 8 mile tunnels for the British Army to get in, so that they would not be sniped at. I mean, the counties along the border, Cavan, Monaghan, Fermanagh, South Armagh, Tyrone, were no go cowboy country, as they were called. The British Army or any member of the British Armed Forces or the RUC, Royal Ulster Constabulary, could not enter there without being in bomb-proof and ballistic-proof vehicles. But when you cross the border at a non-typical checkpoint, you could be shot. I mean, we used to go to a nightclub called the Oasis, which was on the border, and it had a 12-acre car park because it drew all the people from Northern Ireland and the South who want to have a good time, but it also drew vast amount of potential targets for people who were of the mind to do harm to people. It was predominantly a Catholic sort of gathering, and in the 70s, but in particular the 80s and the early 90s, right up to 96, it really got extreme. I mean, in Greysteel, we had one man walk into a pub and just shoot 15 people dead for no other reason than they were just Catholics. So the peace process, as they call it, which was eventually signed in 1998, it took until 2006 for decommissioning of arms to actually be agreed. That arms had been decommissioned by both Unionist and Republican paramilitaries, but they still operate in neighborhoods in the north, and they still operate in neighborhoods in the south, but in a different way. But at breakfast in the morning, the radio was always for all key holders in certain area. Please go to your premises. There's been a phoned-in firebomb threat for such and such. In daily roll call of people who'd either been shot, kidnapped, disappeared, or blown up during the night. The ongoing inquiries into different things like the SAS ambush at, I don't want to call out specific places, but the inquiries into Bloody Sunday, the shoot to kill policy, the RUC, kidnappings. I mean, lots of kidnappings in the south of businessmen. I think the most famous of which was Ben Dunn, who recently passed away, who was from one of the wealthiest families in Ireland. They paid the ransom. But there was multiple international diplomats kidnapped by the IRA. And then, of course, Shergar, the most valuable racehorse in the world, was stolen for ransom by the IRA. So these things peppered our childhood and our early adulthood. Was there fear in the streets? No. But when I went to school in 1981 and 82, I passed black crosses added each 2 or 3 days as they were hung across all the lampposts for each of the people who had died in the hunger strikes in the Maze or the H Block prison in Northern Ireland. So it was always visible, ever present on the media. But it's sort of like this, there was North Dublin locations that were thoroughly well-known Republican IRA hangouts. We drank in some of them because they would serve kids who were 16 or 17, whereas the age was 18. Most of them were in North Inner City Dublin. And copies of Unpublicked were handed out, which was the IRA's newspaper. And there was a very, very, if you went to Belfast, the Europa Hotel, which is the most bombed hotel in Europe, if you went to Belfast, you had to be very careful. Where you went, if you went anywhere, you had to be very careful where you went with a southern accent, as they called it. Because I remember being on holidays in Benidorm when I was about 8, and I made friends with a girl who was also 8, and she was from what we'd call Ulster, Northern Ireland. But she said there was only 2 parts of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So the 6 counties are up the northwest, and then the 26 counties, north, south, east, and west. And I went to my dad and said, "Hey, Dad, I've just been trying to explain to Kira that there's 4 parts in Ireland: Leinster, Ulster, Connacht, and Munster, 4 provinces, not just Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland." And he just said, "Shush now, son," because they were Protestants. So that was in Benidorm in Spain back in the day. But it didn't, like our friend Bono, which is Gaelic for "see you next Tuesday," if you take the first letter of each of those words, would maintain that Dublin was a war zone. It was not, but it was very visible, and it was very visible in more visible in some neighborhoods than others, and the activities of the paramilitaries were everywhere. But were we dodging bullets and dodging bombs? No. If you crossed the border, were you at risk of being killed? Yes. If you went up north and spoke in the wrong place with a southern accent, might you get beaten or killed? Yes. But that is, like, as I said, the more familiar something is, the more invisible it becomes. It's like background music in a supermarket. It didn't stop us doing anything. And most of us didn't have a hatred for any Protestant, but we did have a hatred for the people who killed, who we associated with nationalism, and we did hate those people because they were criminals. But did I support the IRA? No, I did not. Did my family? No, they did not.
So yeah, I don't think anybody could understand the totality of that experience without having that experience. And but it seems that gives what you're involved in today a huge amount of authority. When we talk about AI ethics, and people that use LLMs on a regular basis understand what you've talked about. I've watched your videos about just kind of being gently directed one way or the other, and then also your experience with security and cybersecurity. Would you like to start to go into that? Uh, how you got into cybersecurity, and it would seem that this is something that security is something that was ever present throughout your life in Ireland, and I would imagine that adds a layer of your focus and abilities that might not be with just anybody.
Yeah, so that is a very informative backdrop to why I have very strong opinions about the preservation of autonomy, agency, and sovereignty in the individual and the nation, and the necessity to help people understand, especially in times of alleged emergency, how the centralization of power, whether it's under government or by proxy to organizations representing government, is dangerous if unchecked and not monitored. It's also, having grown up in an environment where propaganda played a large role. I mean, clearly, the messaging in the media in the Republic of Ireland versus the messaging in the media in Northern Ireland were very different. And you could see that from an early age. You could see the same event. I mean, we didn't have cable TV, we had 4 channels. We had an Irish national broadcaster, we had BBC One, we had BBC Two, and then we had Channel 4 when it was launched in the early 80s. And 3 out of those 4 were coming from the UK. And many of the presenters, many of the very popular presenters like Terry Wogan, were Irish people on these programs. But in the news, um, you can see the big difference between the reporting of events from a Irish broadcasting perspective, the RTE, Radio Telefisherin, which is Gaelic for Radio and Television Ireland, and the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. You could also see it in politics, in the difference to the statements made in our bicameral parliament, which is the lower house, is the directly elected element, which is called the Dáil, and the response of politicians there versus the response of politicians at Westminster. And now bear in mind that in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, people did vote for MPs to sit at Westminster. And for many years, many nationalist Republican MPs were voted in, and they didn't take their place at Westminster because they did not recognise the authority of Westminster. That was the idea of looking for their sovereignty. But the Democratic Unionist Party, the Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, and the Alliance Party, as it was called, which was sort of a mixture of both, did take their seats at Westminster. So you saw a very biased, one-sided view being propagated during speaking time in Westminster versus what was spoken in the Irish Parliament, or Dáil, in the Republic of Ireland. So it became very clear to me very early on that opinion was so heavily affected by the simple act of speech by someone on TV, and got me thinking very early on in my career, when we started to use tools like personalization engines in banking to do credit scores. When I worked for Jim Cramer on setting up thestreet.com in New York City in 1996. You know, Jim Cramer, shouty Jim Cramer with all the bells and whistles on his stock predictions. Yeah. It became very clear to me that these personalization engines, which were the forerunner to recommender engines like we see on Netflix, which are a type of supervised learning within AI, we're suddenly moving into an area we hadn't been before. And I have evolved from a position in banking into boutique consulting. And that boutique consulting was under Dr. Fernando Flores, who had been the Minister for Justice in the Allende government in Chile until 1973, when Pinochet overthrew that particular government. And that government was an agrarian anarchic government, so it was communist. There's a iconic picture in Chile of a man standing outside the Parliament building in Santiago, waving a white flag. Well, that's Fernando Flores, Dr. Fernando Flores now. He was 23, Minister for Finance. He went on to be put in a concentration camp for 3 years. Amnesty got him released, and he went on to Carnegie Mellon to do his doctorate and postdoctorate in the biological roots of human thought, and started a company where we would work with people like Cemex, ABB, Asea Brown Boveri, the banking cartels in Mexico, Bancomer, Bitel, and Banamex. And we would not work for fee, but rather a saving on the bottom line due to the reduction of waste by reducing the inefficiencies in organization. And the way that was done was through his work of understanding that all the vocabulary that we use is just window dressing for certain binary speech acts that we make between each other, such as offer, accept, offer, refuse, negotiate, renegotiate, and so on, and normally travel in pairs. And the rest of our vocabulary is window dressing to finesse, convince, or manipulate the mood of the person that you're speaking to in order to convince them to either take what you're giving or give what you ask, and turn that into a way of reducing bias, of understanding of when the words come out of my mouth and enter your ears, how my understanding of what I've said is perceived by you, and taking the uncertainty out of that. So not bulk counting, management consulting, waste reduction, but actual waste reduction by implementing a management process and a waste communication process that took out any uncertainties in, say, business plans or in design or addressable market. And the greatest example I have of the success of that was the hydro turbine manufacturing division of Asea Brown Boveri in Mannheim, in Frankfurt, in Tor 5, who are losing their market share in the supply of these huge hydroelectric down turbines to the Chinese, because the Germans tend to over-engineer, whereas the Chinese do just about enough to get it right, and therefore can sell the same thing to you that works for the same amount of time for less money. And at the end of 1 year, I believe the fee was 120 million, which was a percentage, I'm not sure what percentage it was, of the total amount of savings made and increased revenue as a result of 1 year of consulting with Dr. Fernando Flores and his team, and Billy Glennon of Vision Consulting in ABB. So that too also showed me how words have power, and how bias outside of the context of any implementation within an ROAI, like large language models, but how words, the use of words and the repetition of words, and how the conscious mind and the unconscious mind work together, and how the unconscious mind can be very easily manipulated indirectly to affect and erode certain previously thought absolute pillars of your conscious mind's points of view. And I went on to start a private military security company as a result of certain activities during my early adult life, not as a member of any organization, but as a reaction to certain threats that were made to friends of mine. And that grew into TMG Corp, where we repatriated assets from hostile and remote areas, whether they were people or equipment, or whether they were oil and gas installations that found themselves in hostile and remote areas, whether that was a war zone or a zone controlled by a group all of a sudden like Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, or in the Sahel region, or in North Africa, or in Eastern Europe, or anything along that nature. So not a triple canopy, or Blue Hackle, or Edinburgh Group, or Aegis Defence, or Eric Prince type mercenary outfit, but rather that. And then, of course, we were huge consumers of technology. And because of my background, we consume technology in the form of encrypted communications, small footprint, comm setup in low signal areas. Came to understand the importance of multimodal device interconnectivity and ruggedized laptops, the importance of SCADA systems, the importance of eyes on target, and the use of other technologies to assist you in positioning, target acquisition, or threat and risk assessment. And that evolved into the use of the early use of systems that other people were using for more commercial things into a military and more defense context, which is always ahead of the curve as compared to the commercial or consumer fast-moving consumer goods or high value consumer goods markets. And so therefore we also, we're interested in things like data security, both at rest and in motion, the veracity of the chain of evidence in custody. That's where blockchain gathered my interest. The preservation of video, audio, handwritten statements, the use and passing on of human intelligence without being compromised, signals intelligence, geointelligence, and measurements and signals intelligence. And these, of course, all involve and sort of intersect with the areas of the most interesting parts of encryption, peer-to-peer communications, distributed networks, artificial intelligence or decision support systems or expert systems, and blockchain. And over the years, as I started my first company, which was to be listed on the check mark called Digital Channel Partners for 483 million, underwritten by Dresner Benson Private Bank in London, Fenchurch Street, and Goodbody Stockbrokers in Dublin. And then I also exited from a fourth generation logistics platform called Pivotal to Modus Media International, who used to ship just in time manufacturing in EMEA for people like Autodesk and Microsoft back in the day when we all got our software in big boxes and CDs and lots of manuals, Excel, PowerPoint, and so on, and reducing the freight cost. And that I exited a diversified real estate, residential and commercial portfolio, as well as a chain of pharmacies or chemists before they deregulated the pharmaceutical industry in terms of chemists or pharmacies in Ireland. And during that time, I'm an avid hiker, so I've with work and hiking been in 114 countries. So that's how all of that came to pass, and the trajectory of that and the backdrop of the experience of my youth, and then the backdrop of the experience of my working when I was working for others in Allied Irish Bank, IBM. In 97, I realized that there was a huge opportunity because back in Europe, all the big consulting firms were charging $1,000 a day for 70-year-old COBOL programmers to make sure Y2K didn't make the world come to an end, and also the Euro changeover. So while they were all looking left, I started a systems integrator for new channels to customers, i.e., or namely the web and cell phones using the WAP protocol. And the rest I've told you. So that's sort of the trajectory of how the backdrop of the importance and understanding of speech acts, the biological roots of human thought, propaganda, the use of sound, the observation of how opinion can be manipulated simply by words, let alone interventions of thought inferencing or proximity devices or implanted chips or other forms of manipulation, and also reading people avidly like Huxley and Orwell and Chesterton and Lewis, and even for those that you don't know, Tolkien and Carl Jung, and the idea of awareness, and Hannah Arendt, and being very interested in history and understanding it's a wheel, in my mind, a wheel that we do the same thing over and over, just with different clothes and more impressive technology, studying the Trinity Project and all those things we tend to invent that we realize once invented we can't uninvent. And a real gra, which is Gaelic for love, for mythology, Greek, Roman, Irish, British, Celtic, Saxon.
So
that's it.
So Graham, Andy, I don't know how long you can stay. Andy usually has to leave at 1 o'clock. I'd like to have Andy be able to ask some questions before he goes. Can you stay a little bit after 1?
Are you asking me or Graham? Yeah, I can stay a little bit.
Perfect. And
So,
sorry to interrupt.
okay, so Graham, no, it's okay. Graham, I have a question. How are you integrating this kind of definition of classical literature and Socratic thinking into AI, and how are you applying that for a today thing, right? So I'm lost in the cool, amazing things that you're bringing. I'm thinking through all this stuff. I'm trying to figure out how I can ask a good question to have you bring that into how can people use that today? Amazing background, cool things. That how is that cognition piece working with the current LLMs today when people can use language without kind of a classical literature training? How can they use that, or even a logical training, to ask the LLM the best questions to help them solve their problems? Because I really like the security and the cognition thing that I was reading about from you. And I that's what I want. I want to hear, how are you bridging those two gaps and those two kind of academic, pillars?
I love that question because it's the challenge is to produce your result or your imagination of the most positive way to tackle these problems in a way that is super easy to adopt, just like turning on your TV. But in order to do so, in order to create the solution to a problem, if you want that solution to be viable long term, adopted, and also maintain consistency and evolve correctly, then you must understand all the elements of the problem that it seeks to solve. This is why ethics is more or less despised, because the ethicist is always, as that rule goes, the 10th person in the room, which is to say that given the same information, if the other 9 all agree that it means a certain thing, then the 10th person is obligated to search for every and any piece of information or proof that they are incorrect. So when you start from that position as an ethicist, you can, unless you're not careful, come across as what people call a doomerist, a black pillar, a negative nanny, all that stuff. So you've got to be very careful how you deliver the idea of examining all elements, both that currently exist, and projecting in, based on historical precedent, human behavior, the tendency for people to abuse power once they have it, and project that forward into how these technologies are evolving in their current hands, and then produce a result and outcome that says, here are the main pain points that we suffer from, and here, therefore, is the baseline foundational model that we must create in order to start to address how these foundational problems, through the massive amount of micro incursions which barely go noticed, but whose cumulative effect on the autonomy, agency, and sovereignty of the individual and the nation is catastrophic over time. A little like legal warfare, I should say, or lawfare. You don't notice the bill that passes that takes a tiny dent out of your liberty or freedom, but cumulatively, you suddenly end up finding yourself in an almost totalitarian state. So if you take that as given, then in the Socratic school of thought or in Stoicism, what you've got to accept at all times is that you are always and at all times also biased by your own particular viewpoints, and you're also by observing a particular phenomenon, altering its output. So you need a diverse team, and I don't
Yeah,
mean diverse.
sorry. We've talked about red teaming. We've talked about the 12th man. The same. This what you mentioned as the 10th man. I've called it the 12th man. I've heard it 10th man, 12th man, 13th man, where you have a dozen and then you add one more, and the last person's obligation is to either assume everything is false or everything is true. Right. We've had those discussions. So how can we apply those things to our businesses today? The way that I've done it is that, okay, if I'm going to build a newsletter, this is my cohort, this is my activity, this is what they're interested in, and I test and validate that those things are true as much as possible, assuming using the method that these are assumptions until I prove they're facts. And all assumptions have some degree of failure in them, right? They're either 1% wrong or 99% wrong. And so until they become a fact, they're still just an assumption. We have to then interrogate them and test and validate them against what we're using to build our business. But the struggle that I've had is, how do I apply the assumption to an LLM when it's primarily designed to give me confirmation bias in my answers? It's not designed to think stoically or to use creative or critical reasoning to go, Andy, that's bullshit. Don't no, that's not going to work. And here's 4 or 5 reasons, or here's 3 things that would invalidate your assumption. When I ask any of them, I don't care if it's DeepSeek from China or OpenAI's versions of ChatGPT or Perplexity, or list the models, and I've downloaded, got my own systems, got unstructured, I've got 15 different local LLMs that I've tried and used the same concept on. What's a way that how can I either define a box that I can put an answer in from the LLM in that capacity, or how can I ask a better question, or what's a different method I could use to ask the question to have these things use either a Socratic thinking method or a Stoic thinking method or a more critical kind of reasoning model to challenge what I'm saying instead of just give me confirmation bias all the time?
Right. Okay. So there's 2 essential ingredients to that. You can take all the models and you can make them local all you want, but they are all suffering from the same problem. And that was the subject of a paper I wrote called the Penrose tabula rasa theory. And tabula rasa, meaning clean slate, is borrowed from Rene Descartes. The information that they have been trained on is random, is labeled and annotated, but not fact checked. Since the creation of 24-hour news media by CNN, which everybody laughed at, by the way, because how can you fill 24 hours with news? We used to have news, which was news, until cable news TV had to insert opinion pieces. Opinion then became fact. Out of context quotations and the alteration of digital media became de jour. And all of this has been piled in along with all the other pieces of messy dirt, conspiracy theory, 15 million hours of random YouTube audio to train these LLMs. So you will not get the type of challenging counterpart in an LLM unless you fundamentally address something which is not being addressed, because the people who hold the power in the form of the Magnificent Seven are trying to migrate to AI and blockchain, and they do not want to lose the power of their data modes. And we know that social media, over 16 to 18 years of egregiously unregulated activity, has devolved people's both critical thinking and decision making, especially in the context of enlightened self-interest. That is to say, what is good for me and what is also good while I'm making that decision for my community. They've also messaged out on, for anybody who's watched which I assume everybody has, the social dilemma or the great hack or the big short or any of those, the complicity of a huge amount of ancillary businesses in perpetuating this lie, whether it's about fiscal policy, monetary policy, geopolicy, or national security. We also have a top heavy need for secrecy in programs and in government that has also kept a large amount of data from being entered into these models. We do not have naturally learning models because we do have pre-programmed and inserted prescriptive answers rather than learned answers acquired from crowdsourced knowledge contained in these LLMs based on the political or ideological motives of the individuals or companies or people who control and own them. So the tabula rasa necessarily says that we must use something which we are not in possession of as a species, generally speaking, which is some patience if we want the outcome that you seek. And that is, we must have the ability to take data from structured and unstructured data from the sensory, that is everything that emits a signal, the emotive, that is everything that we write, say, do, audio, socially, privately, or publish, or otherwise, and geospatially, both our movements, locations, activities, and the environment itself and how it's changed, and create a data set that is traceable back to a source of where it came from, who put it up, and whether it represents reality, fact, truth, or something else. Now, that's one side of it. The other side of it is, what is truth? And this is something that people will say, oh, we live in a post-truth society, but they don't know what truth is. Well, truth has three component parts. It has absolute truth, of which it is said that there are only three absolute truths that are absolutely unassailably true across the domain of all civilizations and peoples on earth, and that is that we will all die. We are all born of the union of a man and a woman, and we are all born of a woman. Above that, we have complex truth, and it contains three components: normative, objective, and subjective. But we have heavily weighted LLM training on the subjective element of those three elements of complex truth rather than objective and normative. We have injected, or they have injected, the subjective to be the overriding arc of the information which is put into these narrow AI large language models, and therefore the bias is amplified. And as people build tools upon them, as people put more ideology on top of them, they will only amplify the bias and the rabbit hole, and as per the social dilemma, the algocracy or the algocratic control of what you see and do not see, and your inability to find out where that information came from. And that is finally the third component of truth, which is relativism. And relativism is the difference between me, you, and everybody else from every other part of the world here and their attitude to societal norms, religious norms, economic norms as per their local environment, country, region, or block subscribes to. So the answer to your question is actually that you will. Local is great because it protects your data, but putting your model local doesn't mean it's going to become a companion who's honest with you, will challenge your assertions, and will give you this type of intellectual curiosity that back at you to question things which it has been told are axiomatic rather than theoretical. And that's the essential problem of LLMs.
What an amazing answer. When we started the space, I put in philosophy because I first of all, I love philosophy, but it reminds me of the old Chinese saying, we don't know that we don't know what we don't know. And that's what you're saying, that the LLM has been trained with its own bias, and no matter what we do, no matter what we ask, it's always going to be, the response is always going to be filtered through the bias, no matter what. And if it doesn't know that there's a critical view, it's never, ever, it can't add a critical view to something it doesn't know. Thank you. That clarifies in my mind why I'm struggling to get a different kind of context out of the machine. The machine is I always call the LLM the smartest dumb guy I've ever met. It'll give me exactly the answer. It may not be helpful, but it will give me an answer. It'll give me the best answer it can. but my capacity to get a better answer, it relies on my ability to ask a better question. But today, but that's just asking a question within the box. And my question was, how can I ask it a question that's outside of its box? And as you so eloquently put, I can't. It doesn't know. Interesting.
So Graham, I always, solutions are hard to find. I was thinking maybe if there's a lot of localized LLMs that might, you know, uh, have an effect on the specific problem you're talking about. What do you think? Is there a solution for such a thing? And some of these are definitely more obvious than others. Some LLMs have some real kind of, they're guiding you in a certain direction. And what is the trajectory for going towards, what you mentioned about time and cycles? I don't know if you're into the Vedas, and hearing about Carl Jung is very exciting. um so I believe that the planets have brought us to a certain place, and they really do, more than we might imagine. And so we are locked into something, and it's going to go. It might take 300, 500, 2,000 years for it to to rectify this change that we're finding ourselves in. Where do you think we're going in the next, what timeline's the most likely timeline over the next 3 to 5 years or 10 years?
Well, on the question of I think you said Vedas early on when I spoke about books, essential books. I mean, many of the books I mentioned that I read earlier are currently part of a program in the UK called Prevent, to make them illegal, because they're radical content, believe it or not. And of that I speak of The Doors of Perception, Brave New World, 1984. Lord of the Rings, and so on. Now, the question you asked vibes very much with what Andy asked, and I didn't get an opportunity to thank you for your kind words after I had the opportunity to answer the excellent question. But what we're trying to do is create a cognitive architecture as a blueprint for AI, in the absence of understanding the cognitive architecture that we actually have within our own heads. So this is the absurdity of the situation we find ourselves in. We have people making statements about things in machines that we don't yet understand in humans. So when you have when you're exploring the concept of cognition, or you're looking at cognitive architectures, or you're looking at where we'd be in 3 to 5 or 10 years, and people bring up AGI or ASI or whatever they choose to call it, then they are talking about essentially creating a solution to mimic and clone an artificial general intelligence based on a cognitive architecture of the human brain, which we don't understand, even in the large domain of neuroscience. But what we do understand within the cognitive architecture, unfortunately, as per Jungian thought and as per intel agency activities, both classified and declassified, is how to manipulate certain key parts of our cognitive function, whether it be our sapience or sentience, our state of awareness or our state of feeling, or whether it be to tune up or down one of the 5 major elements of our personality, and also how the unconscious mind interacts with the conscious mind, and how one can be used to manipulate the other. But that's not an understanding of an architecture. That is more how to put into the world a set of thoughts, words, systems, and architectures that reflect an outcome. Now, what is that outcome? I choose to use the CCP's 3 warfares doctrine to explain this whenever I'm asked, and that is to say that the 3 warfares doctrine is how the CCP projects itself internationally through a combination of soft power, i.e., through supranational organizations like the United Nations, the WEF, the WHO, and others, by offering soft loans to poor countries, which they don't look for the money back for, but look for influence instead. much like Sepp Blatter and FIFA and the Qatar World Cup, but except in this case, normally UN resolutions around certain things such as the Paracel and Spratly Islands dispute, the South China Sea, or certain things regarding supply chains or international trade agreements, or votes as to who should be the WHO Secretary General and the attitude to global WHO pandemic treaties and so on. I certainly don't want to cover any of that on this discussion, but that is one part of it. The second part of it is the highly choreographed nature of the release by the CCP. And remember, the CCP, the government controls capital. And if you want proof of that, just look at Jack Ma's career since he spoke out of turn in 2017. He went from being Daddy Ma in China to disappeared. I mean, he's not disappeared, dead, just out of the scene, off of the pulpit, out of the mind's eye, because he went against Xi Jinping's view of the world. And what's Xi Jinping's view of the world? Well, it's Deng Xiaoping's view of the world, which started in 1980, because the CCP strategic time horizon is measured in decades, whereas the West is measured on weekly reports of stocks and shares and the closing position of the Nasdaq, the NYSE, and the S&P 500 on a Friday evening at 5 p.m. Eastern. So when you have the TikTok ban incoming and they have Red Note on standby, when you have a release allegedly by OpenAI, which is going to be a game changer, and X in the form of Grok, and then you've got DeepSeek V1 and OR3, then when you've got XAI acquires X, you have them lined up with Manus and Janus and Yui. This is highly choreographed in terms of the techno warfare that we have gone on in the commercial world to capture the mind's eye. Now, just in Europe the other day, it was proven that the CCP are siphoning the data, as if everybody didn't know that, but it was absolutely proven, and they were fined several $100 million. But who cares, says the CCP. We are creating, just like, and I really hate using this example because it's so out of date, but if you want to match what Cambridge Analytica had a particle of H2O in the Pacific Ocean in terms of user data from Facebook compared to what is available to even somebody owning maybe 6 racks of H200 GPUs right now, who's got access to the data coming from TikTok. In other words, you can personalize as opposed to an election slogan and an election or a policy promise, which you're never going to keep, to 2 people out of 1,000 people in a neighborhood, in a swing neighborhood in Texas, a personalized Facebook ad using Cambridge Analytica, but using opinion, mood, and sentiment manipulation and the information from TikTok with AI, you can, and with proximity devices such as eyeglasses, monitoring your pupil dilation, and Fitbit equivalents, looking at your blood pressure, your skin temperature, your sweat gland emission, and your heart rate as you observe different images, whether they relate to violence, happiness, sexuality, or other scenes which are of a different nature. They can build of you what is your digital twin. And people say, oh, that's really cool. Well, no, it's not, because in Jungian philosophy, and to quote Nietzsche, if you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss may stare back into you. And that's what the pure digital twin of you is, because with your ego, you present a face to the public. It is the thing that you present to the public that represents what you want the public to think of you. A psychopath will do it with particular reason. A normal person just does it because that's the way they project themselves in public. Then you have your what you are in your own mind, what you think of yourself. What I think of myself, despite the fact I'm speaking here now in a certain tone of voice, people will extrapolate what I think about myself, and they'll be wrong because they don't know what's going on inside my mind. But I can infer through AI and FNIRS, frequency near infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS, frequency near image resonance spectroscopy, or EEG and electrocardiography, which are being used by startups on this very platform to gather the brain waves, to gather the size of data sets that allows people to train thought inferencing using proximity sensors. And what better then a proximity sensor that's also helping you allegedly navigate your world, whether it's an enhanced pair of glasses, which allows you to navigate rather than picking up your phone for Google Maps, or gives you real-time information on the stock market. That's the prize for you being the target, not the product anymore. And if you're into it for an immersive MR, the umbrella term, or XR, the umbrella term for mixed reality, virtual reality, and augmented reality, it's still picking up your pupil dilation, and with your Fitbit, with your Alexa, or your Echo Dot, or with your Siri, and with high resolution ed analytics, CCTV cameras, and a footprint of your physical movements and your associates and your networks and everything else. This digital twin of you knows you better than you do in both how you present yourself, how you really think about yourself, and what you're capable of in your reptilian amygdala brain, which is the oldest part of our brain, in moments of great stress, whether it's for good or for bad. And that is the existential threat of AI. It is not neutral. People often use this argument that the technology is neutral. No, it's not. A technology is a technology. They say it's the people who use it that make it for good or for ill. No, it's not. I mean, the nuclear bomb was a technology. It's not neutral. It's destructive. Is AI destructive? Well, I'm writing 3 books right now, and I have been for almost 36 months because I can't get to the end of them. And 2 of them went to the publisher, and they said, this needs to be 3 volumes, which is sort of flattering, but at the same time not, because then you've got to create 3 start, middles, and ends in 3 different volumes. But one of them is called AI and I. Like, what is your relationship between yourself and AI in the human context? The other is this topia, not dystopia, but THIS and topia, coming from the Greek word this place. So this place, or can be read dystopia as in the opposite of utopia, and examines the societal flux, community, familial, and other societal structures that have already had significant changes. And one example of that is how the family unit operates, the availability of free time and disposable income, and the necessity, therefore, for people not to have to cooperate as closely as they once did for daily survival, and also the devolution of the value of privacy. Once upon a time, when I was growing up, if somebody opened your post, it would almost be a capital offense. Nowadays, people are on OnlyFans getting money from strangers to do the most unusual things to each other, while the other person's on a video cam, and press releasing their lives. So the entire idea of privacy, autonomy, sovereignty, and any notion of having a right to own these and to own these without having to opt out of them being taken away from you has been totally taken away from the 2 generations who've grown up in this digital world. And third and finally, the working title is, are we in the 4th industrial revolution or the first cognitive devolution? Because this isn't, in my view, the 4th industrial revolution. The 3 other industrial revolutions were the creation of tools exterior to us, or the creation of processes exterior to us. Yes, they did change our societies in their form and makeup. They caused urbanization. They caused all sorts of other things to happen. They caused changes in empires. They caused the emergence of communism and so on. They caused the emergence of cannibalistic capitalism. They caused this idea of the super elite. We really only swapped in 1913, between 1913 and 1919 and the intervening world wars. We really only swapped the words emperors and empires for governments and spheres of influences. And then after World War II, we really only swapped the idea of universal suffrage and the final removal of most monarchies with prime ministers. But if you watch Adam Curtis's BBC commissions, The Part of Nightmares, 3 parts, you'll see how neo-Straussian thought, and in parallel with Saeed Qutb, who is the father of the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, who was hung in 1967 in Egypt by Nasser, how both Islam and the West and the various political objectives of both have aligned over this period of time in counterfact to each other. and how politicians realized a decade or so after the end of World War II that unless they created something in the public's mind's eye where they were more than just managers of the public purse and suppliers of this new idea of social housing and a social safety net if you lost your job, that they had to create relevance for themselves. And in doing so, they needed to create the idea of manufactured or perceived fear. They needed the bogeyman in the closet, which used to be the Soviet Union. And then NATO hung around for a quarter of a century while the war on terror was going on until Russia became the bogeyman again. And that, in the part of nightmares, also necessitates a reduction in people's value of their freedom and liberty, the confusion of wealth with freedom, the confusion of popularity with freedom, the confusion of being able to move about without having to present an ID card with freedom, but in a society where you can't express yourself with free speech. And, you know, that famous quote from the founding father is true today as it was then. If you, well, before I say it, I'll say this. If you reduce everybody to what social media has done, which is highly interconnected with lots of other people, but an individual, extreme individualism, then when you have extreme individualism, when you have eroded the societies or the pillars of the society, such as religious belief, community, familial structure, then when somebody believes in nothing, they'll stand up for nothing. And it almost becomes impossible for them to be mobilized into any action against any perceived tyranny because they, in fact, do not see it. It is the caged birds chirping angrily at the bird that flies out of the cage, saying, "Why are you doing that?" and causing trouble for the rest of us. And protest and being angry against the cage or the tyranny and giving them the sound bites they want only reinforces it. The idea of freeing yourself from a tyranny is to remove yourself from its influence and create another reality in which you draw people to it. And I think that's been quite successfully done in a number of cases.
It is. I've often described the world as being a giant fishbowl. Everyone is operating inside the fishbowl in the rules of the fishbowl, and a few people step outside the fishbowl and look back and go, "You don't have to do that," right? I've also described it as people. Another visual word picture is if everyone gets in their car, drives to work in traffic, then you're on the road, right? So you get up, you get dressed, you get in your car, you go bumper to bumper traffic the whole way, you work, then you get out and you go bumper to bumper traffic the whole way home. And yet you probably drive by 10, 15 different off ramps where you could literally pull off the side of the road, get out of your car and watch the procession of everyone going and coming to and from work. And yet most people don't have enough courage to get off the road. They just live, like Graham was saying, they live inside their own little world. They live inside that. And one of the things that, well, on a personal note, I want to give everyone the idea and plant in your mind the concept that the world that you were told, the world that you probably live in, is not the only part of the world. There are more. There is a different way to look at things. There is a different way to operate within the same confines of the rest of the universe. But you don't have to be on the road. You don't have to live in the fishbowl. You don't have to be in the places that Graham was saying. You can step outside of that. These LLM tools, they will give you an opportunity to do that. You can ask them. They'll give you confirmation bias, but that confirmation bias can be used to help program your mind to say, I don't have to go work entirely to create a resume or a CV and send that to an organization so that they can pick me and then put me in a cubicle and make me work for the next 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. You can think differently. And I think that's what one of the things that I'm hoping that this show with John and I talking to people about how to use LLM in business gives people a stair step, one step away from the road, one step away from the fish tank, so that they can become more and become who they want. I do have to leave. That's why I'm putting some closing comments in, but I just wanted to say, Graham, thank you for the amazing gift of your time and the amazing amount of knowledge that you've shared with us. Please continue. I unfortunately have to drop off and go back to do some client work. But Graham, thank you for, and it's late in the evening. Thank you so much for taking that time and for being with us today. Speaking for John and I, we both greatly appreciate it. And I know that everybody listening, and I'm hoping more people will listen to by the way, more people listen to the recording than they do come to the show live. So it's always encouraging that we record all these and we share them all. John does a transcript. If you want to get a summary of the points, join his newsletter so you can get the summary of what we talked about today and a link so you can go back and listen on and on. We've got this on live stream. We're recording this, so it's on live stream. It's on YouTube. You can go find these things anywhere you want to go look if you're inclined. But again, Graham, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to talking to you in the future. Thanks again.
Thanks, Andy. And I realize you have to drop 3 quick ones for you. One-liners, one not my own and 2 my own. The first not my own is, I don't know who discovered water, but I bet it wasn't a fish. Going to the point that you made about things are looking you straight in the face, but at the tip of your nose, but you don't see them. And that is the case with many people. The second is that it's my view that, and I said this in a speech about 10 years ago, that democracy was the method by which vested interests allowed the people to oppress themselves with the illusion of choice. And thirdly, which goes way back to probably the first half an hour, is in the business of private military security services, we always say that there's nothing worse than somebody who doesn't know how much they don't know. Because essentially, you always have to go to 100% with that person, because they don't have the common sense, discernment, or let's say, are not in tune with the reality of the world to pull back from a position that's clearly untenable. So with that, thank you very much for your kind words, Andy, and have a blessed rest of your day and week. And thank you again for your invite.
Absolutely. And yeah, Andy has really he asked me to help him with this, so he really started it. And I think we're doing something that's important, because we're having these discussions that aren't necessarily being had in other places. And the idea of reality is so interesting to me. I had a situation where I had to change my thinking, so I did heavy meditation every day, totally disconnected myself from the internet, did that for 2 years straight. And at one point, I had this epiphany. I was driving around town in California, and I'm looking at all these billboards, and I just went, oh my goodness, everybody is having things going into their subconscious mind without any filtering, without any thought, all day and night. And the amount of effort and work it takes to control your subconscious mind is a little Herculean. And I don't think anybody understands that consequences of just letting it lie there unattended. Do you want to share your thoughts on that, Graham?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point I made about the Industrial Revolutions is apt to revisit on that. The 3 previous, which the first was, I guess, 1750, thereabouts, was steam. And we saw clearance of the land of small tenants in favor of large-scale agriculture. The second was automation and large-scale urbanization. And the third was specialization, as per the Ford model. But AI essentially is a cognitive change. And in any one day, more information, either passive or actively, passes through our synapses. And are we capable? Affecting people's discernment, ability to make rational decisions? Do people subscribe to things that they wouldn't normally ever dream of because they have to choose something, or rhythmically are pushed down a line which dunks them in so much, soup from like-minded people that they become of the opinion that they are part of the group? You see, interconnectivity, when ARPANET was released by DARPA, was great. But what it also did was take the one or two people in every town who was batshit and connect them with the one or two people in every other town globally who was batshit. And suddenly they became a huge global force who sort of started to lobby. And where did that get us? Well, it got us a few places I'd prefer we didn't go to, and I'm not going to comment on what they are, but I think it doesn't take much of a guess for people to maybe figure out what some of them might be. And this is the problem with the genesis of ARPANET. You see, the three Irish American directors of the CIA, the most notorious being William J. Casey, he said in 1981, when everything the American public believes is a lie, then we will have succeeded. In the presidential handoff final farewell address of Eisenhower in 1961, as he handed over to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, he spent a full 7 minutes, which you can find on YouTube, saying that before World War II, the American people could protect their liberty and their freedom by taking their plowshares and sharpening them, just like they always had, to protect the liberty and the freedom which the founding fathers had given them in the Constitution. And he warned of the disproportionate direct and indirect influence that this nascent industry, only less than 15 years old, was having in DC and on politics and society in general. That was 63 years ago. JFK, in his last address to the Press Association at the Press Association dinner, said that it was the job of the media to be the courier of news. It was their job to encourage controversy. It was their job to hold government to account and to correct errors before they became irreversible mistakes. He said he would take the CIA and tear it to 1,000 pieces and throw it to the wind, and that secrecy should only be necessary in the smallest part of our constitutional republics, where it was almost utmost necessary and provably so, and should not define our societies. And these two men, both of whom crossed the domain in their lives from radio to TV and experienced seismic shifts in power structures, societal structures, and conflict during their lives, made these statements along with authors of the time that almost on the button predicted the algocratic, technocratic, transhumanist landscape that we occupy today, having only experienced the use by the Austrian painter of radio to win 33% of the popular vote in the 1933 elections, and then browbeat the Reichstag with a false flag into giving him absolute power. Same with Stalin, same with Mao, same with Pol Pot, same with Idi Amin, same with Pinochet. And as Hannah Arendt says, evil is banal, evil is boring. Evil comes from people who you would never think it would come from because they are not remarkable people. And this is what we've got to watch out for, because we have also started to revert to the idea of the cult of the personality, where a person's words overrules the vast majority of the public opinion simply because they say something. And I don't refer to President Trump. I don't refer to Elon Musk. I don't refer to anybody. I'm just saying, generally speaking, I could be referring to Kim Kardashian, for example. People idolize people in a cult of the personality type way because of the way they've been shepherded into this type of behavior. And it is counterintuitive to seek to be something you can never be, and has resulted in an incredible amount of pain for young people in body image, in opinion of self, in the epidemic of psychiatry that we have, and as a result, the epidemic of psychiatric or pharmaceutical remedies for what are essentially everyday experiences, which were used to be dealt with by human coping skills, which have been pathologized and entered into the book of medicine and given an associated drug or set of drugs. So this all sounds very negative, but eternal optimism must also sit with what I said earlier, which is you have to stare into the abyss to see the problem, but you must come out of the abyss with a view that it has always been the activities of a tiny amount of highly organized, dedicated, and fearless men and women who have caused change within societies and at large scale. And that mass revolutions often turn into nothing but worse bloodbaths than they had before, and counter revolution is even as bad. So there is a way to parse our way through this. There is a dialogue that can be constructed to do this. There is moves that we can make. There is solutions to every problem. And it requires people to engage actively in their communities and to engage actively not because they're qualified in artificial intelligence and have a degree or a technical degree, because the attitude of everyday folk, well, and people of every discipline or no discipline is as important as the technologists who write the algorithms, because their views, needs, wants, and aspirations are what these tools will be judging in the near future when they go to access services.
Yeah, I believe you have to stay optimistic against all reason, because the alternative has no future. And sometimes maybe the best system is a system that is totally dysfunctional and can't do anything. But a lot of people don't believe that that's a good choice in politics. But actually, I kind of think that might not be a bad one. Sean Lavery has been having their hand up for a long time. You have a question, and I think I'm going to have to go in about 10 minutes because I have something that I have to do. But Sean, please ask a question, and anybody else, please grab the mic and ask some questions before we close up today. This is really this conversation, I think, it's an ongoing conversation that needs to be had in to for everyone. A lot of mental health issues, a lot of, like, when people are afraid or they're uncertain, they it's that's why no matter what, staying optimistic and against all reason, I think, is always a good choice to make, just because it's, who cares in the long run. We're here for a season, we come back, we show up, it could be here a trillion times, we don't know. So Sean Lavery, you have a question?
Yeah, well, not exactly a question, but kind of just reiterating what GP had been saying about the internet and how social media is so much different than real life, and how you should try to make changes in real life, should talk with people. I feel that that gets past a lot of people's like even just the AI filters that don't even allow your message to show up, or even just their attention span. Like I feel if you're talking to a person in real life, or even on an X space, you have more of people paying attention and going in for the long term content rather than like, oh, this is funny. Like, because everything nowadays has to be a meme for it to go viral, or has to be really catchy to go viral. And some important things are complex and not able to be like sufficiently memed. Like, you can't take a complex system of many systems together and talk about it intelligently that is viral. Like, no one's gonna like you're going to lose them after the first 3 seconds. They're not going to pay attention to the rest of the video. And even if they did, they wouldn't really understand what you're trying to say. But if you say, oh, this popular person is bad or is evil or whatever, is like, that's going to be a lot easier to go viral. Oh, this person did bad thing. Oh, this person did controversial thing. Yeah. So, and then this was from a while back, but someone was talking about the local large language models and not getting the answers they want out of them, or getting too many just like positive things or not getting enough negative. uh, One thing you could do is try to set up something that has multiple AI personalities working on your problem. So you could make a personality that is an incredible pessimist, that is always trying to tell you about what is wrong with something, and maybe have that run alongside your standard model, where the standard one might be like, oh, absolutely, you're amazing, that's correct, this is a revolutionary idea, and blah, blah, like, and just completely fluff you. And versus the other one could be like, oh, actually, that's not revolutionary, that already exists, that's this thing, and they went out of business because no one liked them. Or you could have some kind of like devil's advocate whether you're taking its advice or you're just looking at it and you're able to kind of expand your own critical thinking about the stuff that you're working on, that can be helpful too.
Absolutely. Um, Graham, would you like to kind of direct us out of this? And if you want to, I mean, I have a lot of notes. You know, you talked about rhetoric and vocabulary window dressing. If I'd love I'd love to hear more, because rhetoric, you know, it's you know, it's a weapon of cognitive warfare, or it's a weapon of cognitive thought. And then also what you were saying earlier about, you know, what we have identified and measured in cognition, and the purposes that we took the time and effort to not to do that. And yeah, consciousness is not measurable, it's not definable yet at this point. You know, I mean, David Chalmers talked about you know, maybe consciousness is a fabric of the cosmos, like gravity, like mass, or you know, and it might be it might have relative amounts in almost everything. um and so what does that mean? Like, we're going to get into some weird places, I believe. And I think that we kind of skipped timelines recently, in the sense that there's more doors open than there were before. Where we go is up to us. We're really kind of responsible for it. In my opinion, outlier is you know, the Constitution, in terms of it happened before what might change. But then you know, you can get into a hive mind situation pretty quickly. So where are your thoughts on this? We could go a thousand directions, but maybe if you could land the plane, and then we could um, get towards uh, an end conversation. Um, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I'll keep it brief. I mean, our brain senses. People think, well, that's obvious. Well, it isn't obvious to most people. Your brain and your five senses interact to be the part of yourself that forms your opinion, your reality, and your view of the world, your construct of your reality. And if you are creating a set of tools that can really manipulate that, then you need to be very, very careful. And cognitive resilience, there are methods, but we are not necessarily capable of them. And those who are probably in the same minority as those who can use that brain inside that dark space of our skull to do what we do unconsciously, but to actually interfere with it, which is regulate our own body. Because that's one part that nobody really ever seems to mention, which is in addressing the ability to toward AGI, nobody ever speaks about the large parts of our brain that regulate everything inside of our body, and how our body's motor functions and how our automatic responses are done automatically while we're not even thinking about them, and how certain actions that we do in the physical world, like reaching towards open a handling door or anything like that, are naturally obvious to us. And that's a whole area of study that we don't incorporate into this idea. We are modal, multimodal in our concept of input rather than output. Now, when I said vocabulary was window dressing, I was only using it in the context of utilitarian management consulting. Rhetoric, the arts, prose, poetry, writing, creativity is the crucible of freedom and the crucible of the unknowable and of the divine. It is all of those things that no amount of programming will ever be able to capture, although it can create remarkable works. The idea of original thought, people argue, does not exist. I disagree. But the divine inspiration, the concept of intuitive knowing, the idea that there is a memory on war or a war on memory, I should say, and that memory, without history, there is no memory, and without memory, there is no future. So these things are areas of philosophy and psychology and rhetoric and creativity, which are all outside of the domain of any of the narrow AIs or broader AIs or general AIs that we seem to hear in the debates. And I'll just wrap with this, that the goal that we seem to be hearing people wanting is to transition from this narrow AI to this artificial general intelligence. And they seem to view it as some sort of a tiny, stepping from the shallow end of a pool to the other end of deep end, but it's not. It's a step from the shallow end of a pool into a vast ocean of which we know very, very little. And while narrow AI is excellent at specific tasks, it's not so excellent at complex, multifaceted tasking that also involves human emotions. And remember, finally, to wrap up, most of our lives are governed by the inexact social sciences, um, economics, human behavior, sociology, psychiatry, psychology. All of these things are inexact social sciences by their own definitions because they're based on sentiment and the essence of human behavior being erratic and mercurial and plumbable as to what somebody will do next. And the exact social sciences, as they call themselves, are based on theories. And theories are only information that we subscribe to as the best answer to a question at this point in time in possession of the information that we have, but recognize it is not the actual answer. Because absolutes exist only in the three elements of absolute truth that I spoke about way earlier on. And we would do well to think about that when we discuss AI. And finally, I'll say this, the audience is so full of so many of my friends, both in real life and in people I've met in this community over a long period of time, that there is optimism in these people that I have met. There's optimism in speaking to you, John and Andy. There is optimism, and I think optimism draws optimism and attracts optimism because it is this optimism, and the higher minded ideals will all fall behind it. It is this optimism and this that will drive the necessary change to allow us to get through this very, very, very difficult time of the evolution of our societies and the evolutions of ourselves, and whether we want to remain human or whether we want to go into a non-human, transhumanist type of symbiotic type of existence. I will wrap at that and thank you once again for the invitation. It is a expansive and vast subject when you're asked a question like that, even about one of the things. And as my friend Sean Lavery says, we do actually have a problem with units of attention, and it aside from the memes and the catchy posts, the biggest subscribed to posts shows that people are still curious, but they generally are typically about complex subjects like the natural wonders of the world or some amazing scientific discoveries, but they are fronted by three lines of an explanation and a picture. And that's why you will have people who are on spaces speaking authoritatively about things, who've watched one YouTube video, read a few tweets, and read a book and called themselves expert. And we must not allow that to devolve the quality of education in our society. And we must always be on the lookout for what I call myself people who have been self appointed experts in domains, because I just think that you need to put your shoulders into it. It doesn't require age. You don't have to be like 57 and anybody under 30 can't possibly be wise, but you at least have to have had put your back into something in a reasonable amount of time and effort and experience to speak authoritatively about something. And it's not an age thing. You can be 21 and do it, but you can't just come to a stage of responsibility to your audience and the hosts that invite you.
Absolutely.
Not,
And I do have I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to close up just because I've got something that I have got to do. I have an appointment in 6 minutes. And yeah, I mean, I really like what you said about divine inspiration. I believe that wholeheartedly. Most of the reason why I go for walks and exercise is because that's when I get my divine inspiration. It's not necessarily because for anything else. But you know, the the future is the we have no idea. Anybody, and I do find that people that show up and say they know exactly what's going to happen is you know, it's always a bit of a fool's errand. We don't know what's going to happen, but it is definitely interesting time to be alive, and the idea that we are having to understand what thought is and what is the architecture that creates thought. That was one thing that was really interesting to me. Like, what is that seed? Does it come from the abyss? Does it come from the sea of chaos? um we don't really know yet, I believe, what germinates that. And I think when we have that voice in our head, how do we know that that voice is necessarily of our own making? And then when you talk about, you know, Mike Tyson, he talks about the toad and how he disintegrated, and then what's consciously aware of that which after our personality that is, you know, maybe so totally arbitrary, and is it really the true essence of ourselves? You know, at what point? So what are we fighting for in terms of sovereign, in terms of our own sovereign existence on a spiritual level? It's fascinating. So I am going to have to go. I'm just going to say thank you, Graham. If you wanted to say the last word, I'm going to give you the last word. Please follow Graham and check out everything he does. He has a YouTube channel. It's very interesting. We didn't go into his story about a girl on Mars. That's a whole another level of thinking. And I just want to thank everybody that shows up. The show's as good as people that show up and that participate. So, Graham, I'll just have you end the last words, and we'll see everybody tomorrow and Friday. We have a surprise guest, and so thank you so much. Last words, Graham.
And my last words will be in my native language, and they are as follows: Gareth, Mila Maha, Guth, Ganari, and Boherlat, Slán, August Bannock Day, Erin Gobrach, August Era Abu. And that means thank you, may God bless you, may the wind always be at your back. Ireland forever, Ireland to victory.